Everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. And we're just kind of rattling off some history here, which means I'm here with my boy Aris Pina, who is a CompuBox operator, but also just a fellow fight historian like myself. And today we're talking about like gym legends, myths, all sorts of gym wars and stuff like that we've kind of encountered, Aris, right, in this thread. It's an online thread actually on BoxRec. So we're kind of just going through and picking and choosing these crazy stories from gyms and training and stuff like that and seeing what's what, right?
Yeah, man. There's always been like an unwritten rule, I guess, in the sport, especially when it comes to the gyms, that you don't talk about what goes down in sparring sessions or like, training or anything like that, especially if like a top level guy gets roughed up in a session. It's always supposed to be like, oh man, don't go bragging about it. Don't go put its history out. Don't put video out. It's especially nowadays where that's like more commonplace, where like someone wants to make a name for themselves, they beat up someone who has a name, and so the video ends up somehow on Instagram or Twitter or something, right? And all of a sudden, a name dude you see get like knocked around, and everyone's like, "Oh shit, look at that!" Blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole host of people. They shouldn't be putting that out there. That's not right. Boxer's code or whatever it may be. But of course, boxing's been around since the beginning of time practically. And with that being said, there's a lot of tall tales or stories or whatever you may want to call it that's developed over the years from there. Really interesting ones, in fact. So, like you said, man, we found this BoxRec article thread on the forums, and it was about like famous gym stories, hearsays, sparring sessions, whatever, about concerning a lot of all-time greats, some not all-time, whatever it may be, and what's happened with them in sparring, ranging from all the way back to the days of Jack Johnson up to Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and everyone in between. It's really interesting stuff, man, because it ranges between like stuff that has been corroborated, like some, a few of them, Sonny Liston getting knocked silly in sparring, up till like, wait, what? This makes absolutely no sense. That has to be bullshit. So makes for a fun read and also a fun discussion.
Well, it's, I mean, I guess that we have done a lot of history stuff. And while I think that you and I do, not to toot our own horns or whatever, but I think you and I do a good job of doing our best to make sure that stuff is factual, or as factual as we can make it, or as that we know, or as much as we can research or whatever. But at the same time, there is kind of like a somewhat lighter side of history, the mythical matchups and stuff like that, where it does take a little bit more extrapolation, takes a little bit more imagination, takes a little bit
And
more.
that's a lot of fun, man. I love going
Yeah.
to mythical fights and talking like hypothetically about a lot of different shit and all this stuff.
And we don't really do that a whole lot. So I guess today's, a pretty good opportunity. We are borrowing pretty heavily from that BoxRec thread, but
I mean,
also
that's what I found it fascinating when I went through it, and then I sent it to you, and I was like, this would actually be a really good subject just to
it's
like,
good.
because
It's there's a lot of stuff in there that I had never heard, and a lot of stuff
exactly.
that I have also heard over the years and stuff too. But like a really, really quick example, just to kind of give people an idea of what we're talking about, right? An example, especially like a more recent example or a contemporary example. I remember in the 1990s, um, I guess, well, it was in the 1990s and early 2000s, people on message boards and stuff like that had talked about that Shane Mosley was well known in Southern California as an amateur, as a teenager, for like what he did in the gym and blah blah blah. And I remember I was just kind of mentioning that the other day, actually, because some fighters do pan out, but some don't. Some look fantastic in the gym, some look incredible in sparring, some kind of, that's their claim to fame, is some crazy shit in sparring or in the gym, but then they don't pan out as pros. So that's partially what we're talking about, but just kind of like the random urban legends and myths and stuff like that when it comes to boxing in the gym. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, man. It's like you said, there's always been a lot of rumors that up until today of guys, even up to like Floyd Mayweather getting knocked down in sparring, knocked out, other people getting in the better of them. And then you hear about like rumors about it, and then the video actually does exist. Like, remember for years when the rumors first started about Paul
Spadafora.
Spadafora, yes,
Yeah.
get in the bedroom with Floyd, and then it came out, and everyone, that whole thing drawn out for a number of years from there. And it's interesting, man, because the thing is, sparring is obviously a lot different from fighting. You and I both know that. We're not like, consider ourselves world-class fighters or even good ones, in fact, but like, we've had experience in the gym, we've had experience sparring, and fights and such matter. So
Yeah. We've done enough to know that we haven't done shit.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
we've been in the gym enough to know that like we kind of suck.
Oh yeah, most definitely, man. But like, we've seen enough in the gym too to know that sparring and actual fights and how people react
exactly.
so is like totally different. And so world-class fighters, all-time great fighters, sometimes can get their ass kicked in sparring because they're not even, just for the whatever it may be, just it ain't their day, or they're not even really trying like that. But if that was like, switched into an actual fight, clearly that wouldn't be the case. But there's been a lot of fighters over the years, a lot of great fighters, guys like Muhammad Ali and others who have been known and notorious that have gotten their ass kicked in sparring, even if they've been known for just kind of leaning back a little bit, but like guys have dropped them and so on and such. So
and I guess part of this too, and like we'll talk a little bit more about this and kind of like how this works, or roughly how this works. But I was talking to you before we went on the show that like sparring these days is, and now that the conversation about CTE and what concussions do and repeated hits to the head do, I mean, just speaking factually, sorry to open up talking about some grim shit, but since that conversation has opened up in recent years, we now know that sparring rounds and rounds and rounds and rounds leading into fights is generally not a good idea, just overall. Obviously, you have to find some fine line between sparring enough that you know what it's like to have punches coming at your fucking head, but not so much that it does long-term damage like the sparring itself, or so that you minimize the damage. I mean, however you want to put that. But in decades past and other eras, I think sparring was far more a piece of the training, or, more regular piece of the training than it is now. Like, just another real quick example, Jack Dempsey. This is a guy we talked about when we talked about this, something like this subject like a week or so ago. Jack Dempsey in the gym always went hard, all like never let up, was always unable to like keep himself from fighting at full speed. And so if that's what you're going to do over the course of a decade or two, of course you're going to get knocked down. Of course you're going to get your bell rung, get the shit kicked out of you in sparring if you're constantly going to war. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of tales like that, especially from other eras.
well, that being said, the first one I actually want to dive into, and this is one that I've known about since I was like young, because it's been written about in various books and magazines, and kind of added to the legend of a guy who ended up being a tragic figure. But the story of when a young teenage Tony Ayala apparently kicked the shit out of Pino Cuevas in sparring.
Yeah, I mean, I guess tragic is one way to put it. He's a total fucking
just a
dirtbag.
horrible human being in general, bro.
Yeah.
Like, I don't even, what I mean?
Yeah. No, you were downplaying it, but you're. I know your heart's in the right place. He's a total fucking dirtbag.
I mean, it's completely, bro. That's,
but he was incredibly talented when he was young. Yes. Incredibly talented. He was one of those fighters where he was on the cover of KO. He was, I don't know if he was on the cover of Ring, but he was featured in the Ring for sure a bunch of times.
He was definitely featured on the cover of Ring because I had it. And also, what was tragic was the group he was a part of. If you really want to think about it, the Tomorrow's Champions, because that whole class was like doomed and ill-fated for various reasons. All those guys.
Yeah, dude.
So that in general, but Ayala, total dirtbag. But I mean, yeah, gifted, absolutely gifted from a young age. One of those people
incredibly talented, yeah.
And when he was a teenager, kind of like Mike Tyson, he didn't look like a teenager. He looked like already an adult. So, and built like one as well.
Well, I can believe that too. Like, based on how talented he was, based on the fact that everybody knew he was talented, everybody knew that he was he had a lot of experience and that, you know, he'd started fighting from a young age. And then also Pepino Cuevas, like by that time, probably would have been, you know, a little long in the tooth. And on top of that, Pepino Cuevas was like, I don't want to say one dimensional. That's not giving him enough credit, but he definitely was always looking for the left hook, it seemed. So, like, you could probably
He was
catch
a
him
step
looking for
below
the left hook.
Chavez when it came to like boxing acumen and everything like that. But yeah, he definitely wasn't just walking in there waiting away trying to murder you. Like there was obviously, you know, layers to his game, but yeah.
Yeah, he'd already been dinged around a little bit by then, I would imagine. I don't know exactly when that would have been, but but
Probably I
yeah,
would say late 70s because or yeah, definitely in the mid to late 70s because Ayala by the time he turned pro, which was early 80s. Yeah, so I had to have been like right around the time when Cuevas was closer enough to the in the prime of his title reign, maybe.
yeah, I mean, I could probably believe it too. But
But like you said, he always was like kind of one dimensional. That dude like Ayala, even if so was younger, person that gifted and already his size would be able to piece up Cuevas in sparring, especially if Cuevas wasn't thinking enough, you know, kind of they have the air of a champion that way too. You think you're going in there fighting a rank amateur, you're not going to try to like, you know, it's not going to be that hard of a session. All of a sudden, this kid roughs you up.
yeah, that's true. There a lot of these instances it could have just been catching them off guard. And like you kind of said, like you said earlier, you alluded to that in some of these instances, some of these examples, it's going to be somebody trying to get it over on like a known fighter. And when they're not a known fighter, trying to make a name for themselves in the gym, you know, sparring somebody that everybody knows or whatever. And in this thread, one of the guys whose name came up repeatedly, at least in a few different portions, was Sonny Liston. I
Yes.
mean,
And a lot of the and then that's another one that's been corroborated a lot over the years by different people.
yeah, I mean, it's funny because I've heard, or I guess I should say I've read George Foreman say on a number of different occasions that, you know, there are photos of him and Sonny Liston hanging out and stuff like that. I don't know how true it would be to say that Sonny took him under his wing, but he was definitely in his camp for a bit. And George said that in sparring, Sonny Liston would go pretty hard in sparring, and that in sparring, Sonny Liston was the only person that
Stand up.
could, yeah, that could like actually push him back, fight with him, go toe to toe with him, and not just run away from him or something like that and survive, but actually, you know, do some shit. And so I mean, just based on that, you would think that, damn, that's a hard man. Like that's a pretty scary guy. But then you read this thread and he's like, he's dropped by him. He's dropped by him. He's dropped by him. So yeah, according to this thread, he knocked down hard by Mac Foster. And a couple of posts later, it says young Jack Johnson, Jimmy
Absolute maniac.
Jimmy McCarter, Thad Spencer, Leotis Martin, Amos Lincoln, Ray Patterson, Mel Turnbow, Mac Foster, Gary Bates. So I mean, there are going to be people who hear that list of names and they're going to be like, who the fuck is that? You know what I mean? They might recognize like one or two of those names, but most of those fighters were, I don't want to reach too hard and say that late 50s and kind of early 60s era was too underrated, because yeah, there were a kind of like a bunch of transitional eras after a champion had either retired or whatever that were kind of funky, and that was one of them. And it's not generally considered a super great era. But a lot of those fighters, a lot of the fighters that were mentioned, it was the situation where a lot of those fighters beat the shit out of each other. You know what I mean? Like it was a round robin between a lot of those fighters who were probably mostly like B level, maybe C level, but better fighters than you might think of, especially if you go and you find actual footage, which there is some. Probably about half of those guys have some video on YouTube,
No,
and
you can
they're
find
pretty
footage,
good.
obviously, of Mac Foster. He was a really popular heavyweight, and especially during the time when Ali was going through exile and Foster was on the come up, stuff like that. He was considered one of the top prospects in the sport, undefeated up until Jerry Quarry upended him. So there's stuff out there on Foster, there's stuff out there on Thad Spencer, Leotis Martin, obviously famous for knocking the hell out of Sonny in one of his last fights. And there's photos of Ray Patterson dropping Sonny Liston, because there's obviously people are not sure if that was staged or not, but people don't know Ray Patterson was the brother of Floyd Patterson.
Yeah.
So there's a pretty, it's a cool photo. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, but there's actual motive behind it, is what you're saying. Yeah.
But there's that photo of Liston on the ground. And you see Patterson walking away smiling after dropping him, apparently in a sparring session. But the Matt Foster one is definitely the most corroborated, where I've heard that like he actually knocked the hell out of Sonny, and Sonny was just gone.
Well, and also the dates on most of these is like, who knows how old Sonny Liston was? He didn't even know how old he was. But, regardless, the dates on most of these would have been like, it would have been either around when he was a champion or afterward. So who the fuck knows? You know what I mean? Like, it's really, who knows? And the comment attached to that came immediately after that, his response was, all of whom would have been totally smashed up by a peak Sonny, if indeed they are more than rumors, which I would say is probably true. And
absolutely, man. Liston, you know how I feel about Liston and others. Like, he's just at his peak, and the way his jab and everything else about him, bro, you can't, like, a peak Liston is hard to, I put him favorably against almost anyone in history.
Yeah, I think that what really scares the shit out of me about Liston, watching him, is similar to George Foreman. It's just that when the punches, it's just the punches land, and it's like their entire body moves, like it's like jarring. And I mean, it's kind of like like you said, like neither of us have been like world-class fighters or something like that, but if you've punched another human, like, what it feels like, that usually like you punch and your hand hurts. It's not in your fucking dreams and imagination where you're like, ooh, ha, and you're fucking boxing the shit out of somebody. It's like you land that first punch and you're like, fuck, my wrist, like that's more like it. But whereas you watch these guys and it's like effortless, like it's just nothing. And that's what scares me about a guy like Sonny Liston. You watch him and it's like the way that he is shaking dudes to their fucking core with effortless punches. That's what's scary. And like you said, his jab was incredible.
Imagine if Clay Liston 1 happened during the Twitter age, you know what I mean? Or Twitter was around back then, because like you mentioned, Sonny Liston was the scariest man on the planet at that point, and no one had ever seen anybody quite like him. Like, they've seen devastating fighters like Joe Louis and Jack Dempsey beforehand, but like Liston just brought a different type of aura that had never been seen to boxing, like, to the point where even the government was trying to get involved, trying to dissuade Floyd Patterson. Hey, please don't fight this guy. If you lose, he's not a good representation for us. Like, heavyweight champion was still known as the man at that point, and Liston becoming heavyweight champion was everybody's nightmare. And he just such a very, very just intimidating guy. And the way you said, dude, when he would knock the hell out of people, he just knocked the hell out of them. And while he was being shunned for a heavyweight title shot back then, all the other contenders that Customato was making sure Patterson wasn't fighting, Liston was stomping them. Dudes like Zora Foley and Cleveland Williams, who had gone through their ways of the heavyweight division, proven themselves to be the toppest of the top contenders, and Liston just curb stomped them. You know what I mean? And you can almost like make the sense that like, obviously he was a lot more braggadocious and crazier and outgoing, but like Clubber Lang was like Liston, you know what I mean? And similarities just straight up like in movie version, that was like there was like an influence of Sonny Liston there in terms of like just intimidation and destruction, destroy, that type of shit. Like, he was different. Just different, man. Fascinating guy.
And it was a pretty interesting time too, because there were a couple of different like dynamics working. The fact that he was a black man, obviously, and an ex-con was scary to the white Yeah, with mob ties. It's scary to the white establishment, scary to white America, scary.
Especially very conservative America at that
Yep.
point. That was still
Well,
like, you know.
and that's what's actually really interesting too, is that like there was a bit of a moral panic, because I've posted some of them myself, but like, for instance, like horror comics and horror, somewhat graphic horror movies got really popular for a few years in the 1950s. And all of a sudden there was this big backlash that it was like, that was bad. You know, you can't be showing like bloody comics and shit like that. Like that's, you know, you can't be showing all this like Satan type shit. And so there was a little bit of a like rubber band effect where, you know, they pulled the reins. And so it was like, dude, we got to be conservative about this shit. Similar to, and so then also thinking back a little bit to other more recent heavyweight champions, Joe Louis, who for again some racial reasons and social reasons was very reserved as a heavyweight champion, not very outspoken, kind of leading to Ezzard Charles and both the Jersey Joe Walcott, also pretty reserved, not that outspoken, even though Ezzard Charles was a snazzy dresser and did a lot of shit. But Rocky Marciano, also pretty reserved, not a real big trash talker, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the wake of Rocky Marciano, and then basically to Floyd Patterson, again, really quiet, reserved. And it's not that Sonny Liston wasn't quiet or reserved, because he kind of was, but he was like menacing. Even just his fucking presence was like menacing. And I think that even just in and of itself was a problem. So I mean,
Said it better. Yeah, absolutely. It was
just
his whole
to get
aura,
in
his
the
whole
gym with
presence,
him,
his whole demeanor, and his shady background. And yeah, America was afraid of him. They were just like,
just to get in the gym with him would have been fucking frightening, dude. I mean, shit. Whatever. I don't know
and they
who's.
say, you know what? And the most interesting thing too, and this is another thing I find interesting about Liston, fascinating, whatever, is that like the only people he ever felt he trusted beside his wife was like kids, because they were just innocent. You know what I mean? And there's
Yeah,
that
all the
gift.
photos of him smiling,
Yeah.
he's with
There's
kids.
that gift that I put that, you know, people have put up that where he's holding up a little girl in his arm, and then like he's giving her a scowl, and then she kisses him on the cheek, and then he breaks out in the biggest smile. You know,
Sounds about
it's
right.
yeah.
I mean, he was not he didn't seem like much of a happy camper or a talker in that regard. But I mean,
George Foreman's auto first, because he wrote a couple of books, right?
I think so. I think he wrote like
Okay,
two
yeah.
or three.
So the first one where like, you know which book I'm talking about, the white cover with him posing on the front of it.
I think so. Yeah.
So that one, he talked a little bit about training with Liston, and he said that too. They didn't talk much. If they talked, it was only a couple of minutes here and there. But Liston was a very, you know, quiet individual. But Foreman was just giddy to be around him, anyways.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, I mean, going back to the sparring shit, I also kind of have to wonder, like, how many rounds, how many times did Thad Spencer have to get the shit kicked out of him to finally, you know, beat Sonny Liston up, you know, or how many times did Mel Turnbow have to get knocked down to finally, like, you know, all right, Sonny Liston's getting tired of knocking you down and finally gets knocked down. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how many circumstances are like that? I'm just saying.
You know, there's nose and some kind of like, I saw something was broken on their face or got bloodied up before they were able to get some success like that. No way.
That's what I'm saying, is that this probably wasn't one-way traffic. That's all.
Not.
That's all I'm
You
saying.
know, absolutely not. Sonny Liston was not just walking in there blindside and just getting an ass kicking and just kind of stumbling out from it.
Straight up, dude.
All right, so we went from one now that could be like kind of corroborated because it's been written about to absolutely hysterical. And this one, I'm not even gonna lie, my dude made me laugh my ass off. So LMAO to this one. This one involves Sugar Ray Leonard. All right. And one of his future welterweight opponents, Bruce Finch. And this is one that I absolutely had never heard before. I don't know if you had, but when I read it, I started laughing more and more as it went through it. So, Bruce Finch. Sugar Ray Leonard threw the ropes and out on the ring in a sparring session in Landover, Maryland. According to Bruce, both he and Ray got into a rough exchange. Bruce was backed into the ropes, and as Ray leaned in to throw a punch, Bruce countered with a fast right to the chops. Ray fell by Bruce and threw the ropes and was dangling over the middle strand. He then fell upon the ring apron and was out cold. And this was apparently in in 19, yeah, this wasn't, so all right, here's the full article. Ray Leonard was training for his first title defense against Davey Boy Green, set for March 31st, 1980. Bruce Finch, who at the time had a record of 21-3, 14 knockouts, had a style similar to Davey Boy Green, was summoned from Chicago, Illinois. Bruce had gone through 2 earlier sessions with Ray. On the 3rd day, Bruce was in with Ray again. It was the 2nd round, and I was asked to attack Ray aggressively, which I did. I backed him up and threw about a dozen punches while he covered up on the ropes. Ray then waited and countered me with a hard right left. I was stung and backed all the way up across the ring. Ray then moved in. As I reached the ropes with my back, Ray threw a left right and was about to load up to throw another 1-2. He dropped his left hand, and I bounced out with a right hand square on the chops as he was moving forward. He then fell forward to the left side of me, and he hung through the middle rope strand and was dangling over the ropes. He was suspended on the rope for about 2 seconds. Then he fell out of the ring apron. He was knocked out. I'm sorry, bro. Like, come on.
I mean, it's almost as if like somebody's describing this shit like they got video of it or something. I mean, holy shit,
please, man. Post that. That was.
This is awfully detailed.
This is, by the way, this is the same Bruce Finch that was knocked into another dimension when Ray defended his title against him, in '82. So.
Well, and that's why there has to be, at best, a grain of salt. It's got to take these with a grain of salt, just because, again, it's sparring. Because even if they are true, you have to naturally ask the question, okay, so like, what does that mean? What does it amount to? And
but I mean, that one is just like,
but still,
I can't. That's something I just can't believe that he knocked the Ray Leonard clean, unconscious out of the ring, laying there stepping. That would have made the news somehow. You can't tell me that would have. Even back then, absolutely it would have.
And on top of that, it's like he probably wouldn't have been sparring the next day. He'd have to like stop training camp.
Just would have been. Yeah, the rumors when it went on, they might have even delayed that, postponed the fight or some shit. I don't know.
Suppose it could be possible, but I kind of doubt it.
But you have given him a good sparring session and how they were doing it? Absolutely, I could believe that. But you just say that you knocked him clean out of the ring, and man, that's like reaching as far as like a guy on the street pretending to be Johnny Bratton.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be too surprised with a lot of these. Is all I'm saying. But it's just.
I know that one I just found like absolutely hysterical reading it, because you try to think, then you can see it in his head, like coming up with this and like telling all of his boys afterwards and telling everybody around. And I'm sure it's gone around because here we are reading about it. So
well, and if it did happen, then he fucking paid for it. I'm just saying.
But that's not to say that the segue into another one. That's not to say that Leonard didn't get beat up in sparring, because a true session that did happen to him was before he fought Hagler, and he's gone on the record saying this. Future middleweight champion, who was still a young pro at the time, Quincy Taylor, knocked Ray actually legit like silly in a sparring session, where Ray was questioning afterwards if he was even going to go through with everything.
Damn. Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
That's been read about, and Ray's like spoke about that. Quincy Taylor, who was WBC middleweight champion for a cup of coffee in the mid 90s. Like he knocked out Julian Jackson and then lost it immediately to Keith Holmes. Was a really good fighter, from Texas, really solid fighter, and was NABF champion for a while. Like, there's footage of him out there, but not a guy that's really remembered today, but a very solid pro. And obviously, if he was in Leonard's camp back in the day, he was highly thought of. But yeah, there's a story out there that he caught Leonard, I think, with a left hand that Leonard was out on his feet completely from.
I mean, I could believe it, dude. And also, like I said earlier, there's going to be fighters who are wanting to make their name in the gym off of some other name fighter, or they're just going a lot harder because they're motivated because they're now sparring with Ray Leonard, whereas Ray Leonard's now sparring with fucking, John Jackson. Mm-hmm. Some random guy from fucking wherever, and he doesn't know them from shit. You know what I mean? So I could buy that there are situations where they could get caught or whatever, but that's a pretty fucking graphic and hilarious one.
I mean, it's hilarious, man, because you clearly thought out, gone into plan, and like something that's been like sent out there over the years. Because I can just imagine too. There's a bunch of dudes that'd be like, "Yeah, man, one time my grandfather told me he knocked out Rocky Marciano in sparring. Did he? Yeah, he did. He told me that completely." Or Dickie Eklund for years saying that he knocked down Sugar Ray and getting free drinks out of it or whatever. And
I'm sure. Yeah. Well, sure he got some kind of drinks, but
well, just fighting Sugar Ray, I'm sure he got free drinks for life. I mean, or
I believe it, especially with the mass locals,
yeah.
But
But like, go ahead.
speaking of sparring, another fighter who was really known for sparring in his day, and again, kind of going back to that, I guess, just being hit in the head and sparring too much, being bad for you, but nonetheless producing some pretty crazy wars and moments, was James Toney. And James Toney was infamous for not wanting to train, or at least not wanting to train traditionally, not wanting to do road work and shit like that. But for the most part, getting his training out, doing a shitload of sparring. And I mean, yeah, there's all sorts of stories from earlier on in his career. But one of the more famous ones was from the early 2000s. It was from either 2003 or 2004. I'm not positive, but I'll be brief. When I used to know a bunch of the people from Max Boxing and kind of do some work for them, one of their guys was a video guy who taped a handful of sparring sessions and shit like that. And I think somebody else might have taped this particular one, but Max Boxing got a hold of it and put it up for everybody to see. And Danny Green had gone to Wild Card and sparred James Toney, and it was right around the time that Toney had fought Jirov. I can't remember if it was before or after or what, and I'm not positive about the timeline, but I'm pretty sure that it's up on YouTube if you went and looked. But in any case, the big thing was like, holy shit, Danny Green takes it to James Toney. And it's like kind of true. I mean, he's kind of, I don't know, I guess I'd liken it kind of like the Jirov fight, actually. Jirov, like pushing him to the ropes, throwing a lot of punches, connecting on some, but not really appearing to do much damage. And then Toney countering back with some clean ass shit. But then the funny thing was that at some point, Danny Green started oinking at him and started calling him Piggy and shit, and was just like, come on, Piggy, come on, Piggy.
And then the trash talking really started.
And it took off. And there were apparently a group of kids, some kids who were there like visiting. Mm-hmm. And so Toney lost his shit after the round ended and was like, I'm going to get my gun. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And was, it got pretty heated. But just that alone, I mean, and this shit's all on video too. So this one we don't have to speculate about. That's the nice thing. But
was that from the Max Boxing series?
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I'm not positive who actually filmed it. It might have been filmed by somebody else, but it was filmed at Wild Card, and Max Boxing did like put it up.
Yeah, I remember. I think I paid whatever. What was the fee back then? Like $2 or some shit for the month.
Yeah, I think it was like $4.99 a month or something.
Yeah. Because I did it because I wanted to watch that in the Edwin Valero footage, I think.
Yep, there were a handful of them that were like, Dougie was the big. I mean, shit, we can just skip right to Edwin Valero basically for this, because Dougie was.
Oh man, that's how he started his legend, was his sparring sessions, and you would know this better than I would because you were on the scene back then. But that's how his legend started, was his sparring sessions with like the Santa Cruz brothers and others. No.
Yes, he had been brought. I don't know who brought him over, to be honest, but he had been brought over. And Dougie Fisher was one of the Southern California local boxing writers covering stuff in the gym, or actually going to the gym and putting in groundwork to see who the prospects were and who the kind of up and comers were, who the unknowns were, etc. And I remember him in his mailbags mentioning, holy shit, there's this Venezuelan guy, nobody's, he's big in Venezuela and like he's ranked, but nobody, I guess, had seen him here. Or whatever video there was really scarce. Again, you have to remember this shit's the early 2000s. Like, doesn't seem like a long time ago, and it wasn't a long time ago, but the availability of videos different, just way different. So in any case, I remember Dougie talking about Valero in the mailbags, and then he had also talked about him in like a couple fights and shit like that. And I knew of him, and it was right when Golden Boy was starting, right when Golden Boy was coming about, and he got signed with Golden Boy pretty early. And he showed up at a bunch of Golden Boy cards. Like, I think I might have even mentioned this on another recent podcast or some shit, but regardless, I remember seeing him, and he was just this random ass guy who, because he like cleaned himself up, and he had long hair, and he looked like super hipsterish and had like glasses, and like
Remember the glasses? Yeah,
he was like wearing a suit and like
yeah.
had his hair kind of weird. And so I didn't recognize him at all. I just remember thinking, oh, who's this new like CEO business guy with Goldman? Who's this guy? Because he's showing up with a handful of other fighters and Oscar and shit. And anyway, I just remember hearing more about him than anything. And anyway, when he finally kind of caught on, it became clear why he was such a gym legend. And I mean, he was like other guys we've talked about, doesn't let up. It was like he was always out to destroy some shit. Like if he was in the ring with you, then I'm not saying he never took it light in sparring or never tried to learn, but that guy was unbridled chaos.
But you'd agree, right, that when he was finally featured on mainstream television, or even like his early pay-per-view fights against what was it, Pitlua?
Yeah, Antonio Pitalua, I think.
Yeah. He was already a changed fighter back then. Like the fighter that Dougie, that you're referencing, and that Dougie was even like getting really hyped about back in the day, was like almost different. He wasn't just chasing the knockout. Like when, he finally, like when he got suspended for a little bit, remember with like the brain controversy, his head injury or whatever it was.
Yeah, it's like in a motorcycle accident, I think.
Yeah.
And he had a plate put in his head.
But I remember watching his sparring sessions, and again, sparring is obviously different than the actual fight, but like his sparring, still the way he sparred then and how he fought it and how he fought his actual fights was still really similar. And like he was such a reserved guy, kind of sliding around the ring, feigning, doing this, placing his punches, man. It was beautiful shit to watch, dude. He was incredible. And then completely different than the guy that started getting featured, against DeMarco and Pitalua and other, so on like that, I noticed. But yeah, like, man, just absolute fury. But them sparring sessions, man, he was lighting up everybody.
The way that he was, that's how he got noticed in the gym in the first place, was how hard he was going in the gym. And I mean, like I said, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like you're going hard, and you're like iron sharpens iron or whatever, type of shit. But at the same time, that shit over time gets weakened and dull. And I mean, perhaps there's some argument with Valero, that's what happened, but yeah, well, it's pointless speculating all that shit. But regardless, he was obviously a beast, a very feared guy in the gym.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Most definitely, man. Well, to go from that, dude, like, I mean, there's a lot of like what ifs with him too, that people always speculate what could have happened with him, what was going to happen. I'm sure the Pacquiao fight eventually would have happened.
Seemed like it would have. Yeah,
he was with Arum at that point, right? Well, by his last fight, who was promoting? Was he still with Arum? I don't even know. Because I know Gary Shaw was with DeMarco, but
I'm not even 100% sure, to be honest.
But I'm sure that's what they were angling to. Eventually, something like that would have happened. But that would have been, as long as it would have lasted, it would have been an awesome fight.
I'm actually about to look because I'm curious myself, and it should say on so DeMarco. Oh, it just says Gary Shaw and Fernando Beltran. So he might have just been with like Zanfer,
okay,
or something like that. I'm not even 100% sure.
But to go from one Southern Cali gym legend to another, you actually alluded to him earlier when we discussed in the beginning of the show, Shane Mosley.
Yeah,
Shane
dude.
Mosley, as like a young amateur or like a young pro, was lighting dudes up in the gym to the point where he actually altered a couple of careers because of it. You know,
Yeah, dude. I remember again, kind of when he was transitioning from lightweight to welterweight. Well, I guess there wasn't really much of a transition. He pretty much just jumped from lightweight to welterweight, which in and of itself is a move that you don't see very often these days because of the fact that there's a whole junior welterweight division between them that in and of itself is its own animal, but also because he jumped to welterweight to, specifically with Oscar De La Hoya in mind. But I mean, right around that time, I remembered kind of hearing guys like Dougie and stuff like that. Like before Max Boxing, he was part of a website that was called House of Boxing, that was a Southern California based boxing website. Which
that's why I
I,
discovered them.
if you want a little bit of a trivia, I'm not 100% sure if it's totally accurate. But this is what I have heard from them, but that Dougie was the first ever person to get a credential for a website for like a boxing card. So for House of Boxing.
He
And
was the
it's
first mailbag I remember reading, all the way back to he was getting hate mail for Hopkins Trinidad. He was
dude,
like picking Hopkins and all. Everybody was like writing to him and threatening to beat him up and all. So this
yeah,
stuff was
he had a Monday mailbag and a Friday mailbag. And I remember both of them
all the way
were
back then,
always,
man.
yeah, they
I've
were
been up to
always,
this for 20 years.
dude, yeah, it's been a long time. It's been a long ass ride, but it's yeah,
So
that's where I remember hearing about a lot of this stuff, because he would also had a SoCal notebook that he would do where he would kind of
I remember
report,
that. Yeah.
he would report on Southern California prospects or what he'd seen in the gym or whatever. And in any case, I remember back then he would talk about like stuff that he had seen from Shane Mosley in the gym just himself. And if you think about that, like obviously he's only seeing a really small slice of what's happening. So there's obviously a lot more happening. And Shane Mosley had started fighting since he was pretty young, since he was like 7 or 8 or some shit, I think he'd said. And in any case, I remember also reading before I had even read about what you're about to mention, that he had given Julio Cesar Chavez as a pretty young kid. Well, not a young kid, but as a teenager, he had been put in with Julio Cesar Chavez to spar and held his own, and it sometimes gave him the business and was outboxing him, which, given he was a teenager, obviously extremely impressive, because he would have been, like pound for pound Julio Cesar Chavez, that is, around that time.
Yeah, that was around the time when Chavez was. I think it might have been this. I don't know if that was the same day that he sparred De La Hoya, where he dropped De La Hoya or not, but around that same time. But yeah, Chavez was sparring with different amateurs at that point. And Mosley was one of the guys he went into, and Mosley was a phenom back then and a gym legend. Like he's known as like a Southern California gym legend from the early '90s for what he did. And like you mentioned, the Chavez session where they both went really heated, they went back and forth, and I wish there was footage of that. They might be, I don't know, but Mosley, like you said, definitely wasn't slouched on that and held his own more or less. But what he did in terms of altering careers, the first one was a fighter by the name of Zac Padilla, who I'm not even sure if we've even really brought him up too much on the show. But Zac Padilla was a former WBO junior welterweight champion from the early 90s. So, the WBO back then didn't really mean much, but Padilla was an all action fighter. If he was around fighting today, he'd be super duper popular. Guy threw a bajillion punches around, actually held the CompuBox record for most punches thrown in a fight combined with my buddy Ray Oliveira for a title defense in 1993. So Padilla was a longtime fighter. He was 22-1 when he had to retire, and when he fought, when he became WBO champion, he made a number of defenses of the belt, including the one I just mentioned against Ray Oliveira. Also stopped Juan Laporte. Like he was a very fun action fighter, made for really good fights. Threw hundreds of punches a fight to the point where he was always, he was clocking in at over 1,000 punches out on average, a fight at the end of it. until he sparred Shane Mosley. And they had such a heated sparring session it was that Padilla suffered a brain bleed, I believe it was, and he was forced to retire.
That's obviously pretty crazy shit.
Yeah, man, at the peak of your career as champion, whether it's WB or whatever it was, but Padilla, even though he was like a lesser champion, that doesn't demean the fact that he was still one of the top fighters in the division and was going to make for some money fights sooner or later. And yeah, it got cut short because of a sparring session.
And there are a number of different stories of fighters getting messed up in sparring or training or whatever, or in like an amateur fight or whatever, that have led to more permanent injuries or issues. But I mean, that's pretty crazy shit.
That wasn't even and Mosley wasn't done, because when fast forward a couple of years, Genaro Hernandez, the late great former junior lightweight champion, was moving up to fight Oscar De La Hoya in the undefeated pay-per-view fight. And I think it was before that fight that I think Mosley smashed his nose in a sparring session before De La Hoya completely shattered it.
The takeaway is obviously stay away from Shane Mosley in the gym.
I believe that's the case. I could be wrong, but I think I do remember reading some. Yeah, but Mosley was an absolute animal.
Well, and I think I've brought this up. Not sure if I brought it up on the show before, but it's just another kind of like little trivia tidbit. But another wasn't in the gym, but it was at the Pan Am Games. That was where David Reed got his eye busted by who was his name? Daniel Santos, the dude Margarito fought twice. Yeah, Daniel Santos busted him in the eye and fucked his eye up. And that's what caused his eye he got like a detached retina from it, and then wound up having to get surgery, and then had a drooping eyelid, and that wound up causing him issues throughout his career. And that was before he even turned pro, and allegedly why he got fast tracked as a pro and wound up getting beaten up pretty good by Felix Trinidad. And he got beat up in a couple other fights too,
Well, he was ruined in that fight, man. And I remember picking him to beat Trinidad, one of my many, definite fumbles.
He wasn't that far from it. He started out real good.
He did. He did. I was looking real good too. I was hyped. I'm like, man, he was putting the beats on Tito, and then he dropped him. You know
I mean? and then dude, you can't drop Tito. Like, you got to just slowly whoop his ass, because
you got to do what Hopkins did and beat him down. So when you finally drop him, he has nothing left to come back with. But no, you finally dropped him, woke him up, and then Tito just. And that was one of the worst sustained beatings. That was oh my God.
Yeah, that was bad, dude. Toward the end, it was like, he was like hanging on and shit.
Hanging on, just had nothing else. He was like trying to smile to play it off, but you can clearly see he was in agony. Like, he had, God, man, Tito in 2000, bro.
Tito is one of those fools where, like, when Fernando Vargas dropped him, and that was not a super hard knockdown, but it wasn't nothing. Like, it was a hard knockdown. It just wasn't like, it was just, the thing is that I think they made it seem, especially the announcers, are like, oh, Tito's hurt. But then he goes to the corner, and I think it's Jay Nady asks him, like, you okay? And it's like the look that he gives, he's like, fucking, of course. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Get the fuck out of my way. Like, and it's like, it's right at that time where I'm just like, oh God, dude.
And that was
every single time I'm watching that, I'm just like, oh man, this is going to be so bad. But you couldn't knock him down. You only woke him up. That's the only thing that happened against David Reed, though. Poor guy. He got fast tracked to Tito because of that eye. And that happened in a Pan Am game. I think it was the final of the Pan Am games. And I want to say 1997 or something like that.
Well, no, he won the 96 Olympics, so
maybe it was 1995, because Pan Am games happen on odd years. Like, they happen on, like,
so it had to have been around 95.
Yeah, so then maybe 95. He had a
droopy eyelid when he won the games, if I remember.
Okay, well then it was probably 95, because I know they're on weird years. But in any case, yeah, there are all sorts of these stories of somebody getting messed up, like in sparring or in the gym.
there's a KO magazine that came out around 98, 99, whatever it was. And it had a photo of Vargas and Reed on the cover, both of them posing up with their fists up together, right? And it was like, hyping up a future fight of both of them. And I still have it because I remember like pulling it out the other day. I'm looking at it, I was like, man, Tito ruined the shit out of this fight.
Good old fashioned all-American junior middleweight showdown,
Yeah. Another guy too that's had some interesting sparring sessions, and you've seen it too, was Mike Tyson over the years.
There are a lot of rumors and stories that came out of the gym for Mike Tyson training camps. And obviously there's I'd say two famous ones, but there are a handful of them throughout the years, especially more if you read this thread. There's a bunch.
Well, the one that a lot of people, and it can be corroborated because it's been seen, was before he fought Buster Douglas. He got dropped by former WBC heavyweight champion Greg Page in a sparring session. And it wasn't and that wasn't just like a slip. That was like a legitimate knockdown. Page caught him good.
Yeah, there were obviously there's every time you bring up like Tyson Douglas or Tyson from around this time, dude, you got to watch out because there's going to be motherfuckers trapezing in and going like, he was on so many drugs at the time, bro. His life was so fast. Fuck. And you're like, dude, I'm just talking, just saying what happened. Yeah, he was. It was pretty crazy, but there were.
And he almost still won. Okay.
Yeah, he really was not too far away from it. So he obviously wasn't in that bad a shape. But no, that's leading up to that fight. That's definitely one of those kind of footnotes where you do have to wonder, a guy like it's not like Greg Page is total trash or anything, but it's the caliber of fighter that you wouldn't think Mike Tyson would be getting dropped by Greg Page, generally speaking. So,
and Oliver Mccall, I think there's been,
and that's the other one. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, that's the other one. Yeah, I think was the other one that I was going to say. If you've heard, then it's Greg Page, and all of them are. Wow, what is going on? Oliver Mccall. Holy shit! Atomic Bull, the Atomic fucking Bull.
Well, speaking of, man, it's only thinking of that. Like, I've seen it. I don't think there's footage of Tyson getting dropped by Mccall, but there's sparring footage of them sparring. It's it's solid fight. It's solid stuff. So that brings the question of, if Mccall had not lost to Bruno, then Tyson would have fought him instead, and that probably would have been a good ass fight. If Mccall had his head together, which is a big if at that time period. But Tyson, if you watch back on his early fights, obviously now in the early 90s, and the way he looks and stuff like that, and how kind of rusty he was, and he was extreme. Even in the brief fights with the McNeely fight, you see how awful he looked and how rusty before, McNeely's McNeely. And then the Buster Mathis fight, he was getting out boxed for 2.5 rounds before he caught him. And then
shitload of just like empty lunging, just like punching and then like having to follow through with the punch, like almost into the ropes because he's so off balance.
He looked bad. And then he finally, he fought Bruno after that. If that was Mccall instead, that could have been interesting.
Oliver Mccall is one of those guys who, I've used this phrase before, but it's not like it's like I invented it, but fights up or down to the levels of his opposition a lot of the time. Like, you put him in with somebody who like wasn't going to challenge him or was just going to kind of box him, and he was just kind of fall into that sparring partner mode, it seemed. But if you put him in with somebody who was going to try to whoop his ass, somebody who's going to kind of wake him up, then he'd fight back and fight hard. And he seemed like the kind of guy who would get up for a Mike Tyson fight. You know what I mean?
So, absolutely. Yeah, man. And I always had a soft spot for Mccall, even after his breakdown with Lewis. And I love watching that video of when he knocks out Henry Akinwande in basically an empty arena. And the way Akinwande just collapses, and you hear Mccall, ah! Just chanting. It's awesome.
Well, not to get too fucking real or philosophical, but I guess now viewed through the lens of having a better understanding of mental illness and drug abuse and the toll the psychiatric toll those things take on
Mhm.
people. Watching that, like, of course, throughout the 2000s, bro, like the fucking Lennox Lewis Oliver McCall rematch, photos, gifs, videos of that was like high level fucking comedic response to literally anything. You sad? Here's the photo of Oliver McCall sobbing in the ring against Lennox Lewis because it's hilarious. Ha ha ha. Everybody, wow. But then, like, of course, now years later, we know that he was basically forced into this fucking fight, addicted to crack, and probably had a lot of mental illness issues that he was dealing with. And so viewed like
And
that,
John
it's
was
like
just like, "No, I need a title fight. Get in."
kind of fucking sad, kind of, real sad. But I mean, like you said, that you had a soft spot for Oliver McCall, dude. He's underrated, and he actually had a better kind of career resurgence than he probably gets credit for, even though he wasn't able to make as much of it as he possibly could have. But he was already old by then,
But just the fact that he was able to come back from his addictions and his
It's
the
a big
mental
W
illness
for
that he's
sure.
going through, that he had like a relatively successful, comeback to the point where I think it like culminated against Juan Carlos Gomez or something like that. But still, it was like close enough. You know what I mean? Like he was ranked back up in the top 10 at one point. Knocking out Akinwande, everything. Yeah, man. Got to give him a call credit. But here's another one, man, that I found this actually pretty interesting. In May 1949, heavyweight contender Jersey Joe Walcott used middleweight Charlie Burley as a sparring partner. After 1.5 rounds, Burley quit and headed for home. Burley was given a severe jolting by Walcott and had his nose broken. That Walcott isn't kidding. He blasted me with a right hand until I was out on my feet. I never thought that would happen first day at camp. I'm heading for home.
Man, shit like that really puts, for me anyway, into perspective. Like, so you have Ray Robinson, who fought as an amateur as a lightweight and was like a good, obviously a good sized lightweight, but not a massive. Well, I mean, he was a pretty big lightweight, but not a massive lightweight, I guess. But then moves to welterweight and is like a pretty good sized welterweight. But then by the time he gets to middleweight, he's a little bit older. And even if you just look at not only video, but photos of Ray Robinson as a middleweight, he's not pudgy, but he's definitely not ripped.
Nah,
And
you can see he had a little bit of a love handle at middleweight. Like he was still slim and in really, really in good shape, but he was
yeah,
ripped. Yeah.
he's in good shape, but he's not in great shape. And his legs are like not super toned.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to be a fucking fitness expert here, but then like my whole point is then the whole narrative is that he ducked Charlie Burley, right? Like he'd never fight Charlie Burley. Holy shit, Charlie Burley, way too scary for Ray Robinson. So okay, fine. But then, Charlie Burley gets in with Jersey Joe Walcott, who himself was not at all a big heavyweight, and gets the shit kicked out of him. And like I'm saying, I'm just kind of thinking of perspective here. And Ray Robinson was talking about going through Joey Maxim to fight Floyd Patterson. And it's like, just, I don't know, just trying to connect all of these dots to me is like, I think Ray Robinson would have gotten slaughtered by somebody like a Floyd Patterson, Jersey Joe Walcott, a lot of these type of fighters, especially if Walcott is walking through Charlie Burley, who himself was, no slouch. But I don't know, just kind of adding perspective to that is pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, for sure, man. Walcott was obviously, like you said, he wasn't a big heavyweight whatsoever, but he moved in his style and the way he was slick, and obviously he can match
And he
Burley.
could bang too. Like
Yes, and
he wasn't a big guy, but he could bang.
but he was the way he fought at heavyweight, man. He moved like a middleweight. Like I love watching Walcott videos because you can almost put like a beautiful jazz track behind him, whether it can be like someone like Hank Mobley or someone of that ilk, and just let it ride. And you watch Walcott and you watch his footwork, bro. And of course, he's going to be able to hang with Burley. He can hang with anyone in history, man. Walcott has some of the best footwork you'd ever see. And like you said, he could bang because he was quick triggered. Like his stuff came out of nowhere. He just shuffle, boom, 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 pop, and then he catch you with a left hook when you weren't seeing it, or he catch you with a right hand, anything like that. And if you tried to bang with him, he had really fast hands, and he'd be able to, because the way he shuffled his body and everything, he'd probably catch you first before you caught him. So yeah, fighting him would be a nightmare. And it's no surprise that he'd probably be able to bank up. Even though Burley's an all-time great himself, Walcott was just a bigger version. So it's like,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's not gonna.
Well, and that's what I mean is like, I'm not talking about like quality or anything like that, but just like there's limits, like there's size limits.
Yeah, and
And
Walcott was just one of those guys. I can just see it too. He's coming off the ropes and just like it's great, all-time great guys. Like Joe Louis struggled to hell with him because of how first he was already past it at that point, and two, style like Walcott would always give him fits because of the way he moved in. Like he, unless you can really get to him and bang with him and catch him too, because Walcott could be hurt and could be dropped and everything. Like you're going to go through hell to get to that.
yeah, there's no question. And I mean, dude, so it's not even remotely surprising that a guy like Charlie Burley or like a guy of his size would get hurt by Jersey Joe. But damn, I'm almost kind of feel bad because I thought Jersey Joe was better than I thought Jersey Joe was a nicer guy. Like he would be whooping Charlie Burley's ass in sparring, but maybe not.
Man, Jersey Joe like seemed like a really classy dude, but he's also seemed like he took like pleasure in beating people up. There's photos of him and his opponents all bloodied up, and you see him grinning while he's just walking forward and just doing his shit.
Yeah, there's enough video of Jersey Joe Walcott to know that he was a bad dude.
He's one of my favorites, man. Like I said, you can love watching him, and it's too bad that like he's one of those guys that I wish I could have met, but he can't. He was about a decade before I was able to get to the Hall of Fame and do stuff. You know what I mean?
Unfortunately,
I think that, yeah, he passed in the early '90s, I believe it was.
and unfortunately, post boxing career, fighter career, while he was
Oh boy, I know where you're going with this one.
And it ties directly to what I'm about
I'm
to
just
say
saying,
too.
man, as smooth as he was in the ring during his career, that didn't translate as a referee, did it?
No, unfortunately not, bro. And yeah, in the
Who?
Ollie Liston rematch, he had a real poor performance enough that it was like really memorable. But apart from that, it's unfortunate because apart from that, he was actually very instrumental in the New Jersey Athletic Commission. Like he was part of the New Jersey Athletic Commission and a big part of the New Jersey Athletic Commission and boxing scene. So that should have overshadowed his really crappy refereeing performance. But man, that fight is just like it's cursed. It's just cursed.
I mean, yeah, it's absolutely hysterical from start to finish. The way he just looks utterly confused and befuddled and bushwhacked and whatever you want to use about it. Like he doesn't know what's going on. And to the point where he goes to Nat Fleischer of all people to get advice. And you see him too. Who? What? And Liston's flopping on the canvas. Ali's running.
Yeah,
around
they're like going back to fighting, and he's like running away from the action.
Back fighting, yeah, and he just kind of like he runs away, like But I'll tell you what, my first introduction to Jersey Joe Walcott, I didn't even realize this as a kid. But my first time I ever saw him was on a VHS tape when he was refereeing a boxing match, in fact, between Andre the Giant and Gorilla Monsoon in a rainstorm in Puerto Rico.
Oh my God.
It's really, yeah. It was on some VHS tape I used to rent for like WWF or something, but like it was on a compilation. You see him in the middle of Andre and Gorilla Monsoon at absolute monsoon, no pun intended, like coming down on water and stuff like that in the middle of the ring. You see poor Jersey Joe like up to their waist trying to like push them aside, and
Well, I believe it. I want to believe it anyway, just because I love it. The more Jersey Joe Walcott stories, the better, Well, like speaking of heavyweight champions and sparring, Muhammad Ali's got his own handful of gym stories.
You could write a book on Ali's gym stories and what happened in Deer Lake. Bro.
There probably are books about it, to be honest. I mean, there's so many books about Muhammad Ali, I wouldn't be surprised.
That would be a book I would read. If there's gonna be another one I would read about Ali, it would probably be like a sparring partner's account of like how it was in training camp.
Well, we've already had that. That actually was one of the more enjoyable specials or documentaries or whatever, that Facing Ali. in my
Yeah, that's my
opinion.
favorite one. That's my favorite one because it features his opponents, not so much just Ali.
Right. And I mean, I'm not trying to like trash anybody, but it's just like we know the Muhammad Ali story inside and out to the point where, at least
There's never
as
been
far
a
as his
fighter
pro
as
fights,
documented as Ali has been in history.
yeah.
Never.
So at least if, with like sparring or something like that, that would kind of be a slightly different angle. Don't get any ideas, anybody. Don't do it. No, I'm just kidding. No,
I
but
mean, like a dude from like the perspective of someone, say like Tim Witherspoon, who did spend a lot of time with Ali in camp and sparring with him, or someone, others like that. There's still people around from that era, but that would just be interesting instead of just another one like another version of an Ali biography or whatever you want to call it, because there's a bajillion of those.
yeah,
But
exactly. That's
as,
all.
but as to you were saying, man, yes, Ali has a ton of stories and a lot of sparring partners throughout the years.
Probably one of his most famous sparring partners, or I mean, for a reason. But Jimmy Ellis had been in camp with Muhammad Ali, being from Louisville. Um, Jimmy Ellis had been in camp with Muhammad Ali for a number of, I couldn't say years, but for more than one fight. I can say that for sure. So they knew each other well. And I think that at one point they were friends, but then, finally it kind of came to a point where they obviously had to fight in the pro game. But there were stories about Jimmy Ellis doing very well against Muhammad Ali in the gym. And supposedly years later, they had sparred again. And Muhammad Ali, again, we talk about the idea of fighters getting up to fight a name, even if it's just in sparring. And this isn't quite the same thing because Jimmy Ellis and Ali knew each other, but still, I guess if you're Jimmy Ellis and you're getting paid to spar Muhammad Ali, even if it's like a latter day Muhammad Ali in the late 70s, you still might put a little bit more into your shots than if you were sparring someone else, maybe. But regardless, there was a story that in 1977, when he was supposedly getting ready for Ernie Shavers, Jimmy Ellis sent Ali to the deck twice in one round, according to this BoxRec thread. There's some quotes, so I'm kind of apt to believe it, but I didn't look them up. I'm not going to lie. But it says, apparently the knockdowns were so severe, Ali couldn't remember them. And it was said he would have been counted out in a real fight, and it resulted in an injury to Ali's neck. Ellis had been retired for 2 years. So, like I said, I could imagine a scenario in which a retired Jimmy Ellis gets paid to come back and spar Muhammad Ali and puts him on his ass for sure, especially that version of Muhammad Ali. So, in any case,
And Ellis could punch. I mean, regardless, there's a lot of, you remember the videos of Ernie Shavers stretching him and Joe Frazier beating him, stuff like that. But Ellis at his peak was a very fast, high octane fighter who had fast hands and was a sharp puncher. And if he caught you good, he could, knock your head off too. Actually, he had Shavers hurt before Shavers finished him. So, Ellis was a very good fighter. So, yeah, it's very conceivable they probably got the better of Ali and beat him up a few times. Definitely. Speaking of Shavers, another story that this one is a true one, but it's just, a crazy sparring legend, was when he sparred a fighter by the name of Jeff Merritt, heavyweight Jeff Merritt back in the day. And we've talked about Jeff Merritt on the show, I'm sure, before, right?
yep. Hell yeah.
Yeah, Jeff Merrill was Don King's first signed fighter. Heavyweight with an absolute monster punch and a very interesting background himself, who, CED and stuff like that. And unfortunately, didn't really get a chance to pan out to his full potential, but he showed flashes of it in his brief career. And what he did, man, that guy was an absolute monster, to say the least. But the story goes that he used to spar with Ernie Shavers back in the day, and Shavers used to take, liberties with him and just kind of beat him up, rough him up with him and stuff like that. Didn't take it easy on him. And Merritt took the beatings, but always kind of kept that as a reminder, saying, he'll get payback one day or whatever, because he felt Shavers kind of took advantage of him. So long story short, Shavers was training to fight Jerry Quarry, and I think it was Archie Moore who was working with Shavers at the time. I could be wrong, but I'm just going off of this. Decided to put Merritt in with him. It was put a Merritt in with Shavers to spar. and Don King, I think was against it, but he didn't even know about it. So Merritt got in the ring, and when they were sparring, Merritt broke Shavers' jaw, obviously, ruining the fight and everything like that. And they freaked out. Merritt got in trouble. I think Archie Moore got fired because he was like, "What the fuck? You just ruined everything. How dare you put Shavers in there with him and get his jaw shattered, all this other stuff." Merritt did that as a receipt because he said he did that on purpose to kind of payback. He said for everything else Shavers treated him, and then Gil Clancy, who was working with Jerry Corey, when he heard the news, he said something to the effect of, "You don't fight a Jeff Merritt unless it's for money." Like, that was just a stupid risk.
Yeah, definitely falls under the into the category of Jim legend, Jim myth, as far as Jeff Merritt, for sure. Like, we already know Candy Slim. We there's a little bit, a verifiable, but there's a lot to the legend of Jeff Merritt, for sure.
And there's stories of Larry Holmes driving around with him, and Jeff Merritt demanding him to drive him to the hood so he can go buy weed and other stuff. And then while they were driving around afterwards, he was ranting about what he was going to do to Don King because he needed his money. Remember, this was Don King's first fighter. So obviously this was the first fighter Don King ripped off.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And Jeff Merritt wasn't the type of guy you wanted to rip off either. He was the type of dude that he was unhinged. We could do our own show on this guy one day because he was such an interesting figure, and his story is so interesting. But yeah, long story short, he wasn't the type of guy you wanted to piss off. But there is footage of him, and if you see this footage, I will say this, you watch this footage and then you would think of the Shavers thing, you'd be like, you know what, that makes total sense that he could break Shavers' jaw. There's grainy footage of him fighting Ron Stander. Ron Stander is probably most famous for getting stopped by Joe Frazier and his face looking like a railroad map after, getting sliced up or something, right? And also pretty well known for being featured in the Terrence Crawford fight. I think Crawford Gamboa. He was ringside.
I thought you were going to.
When he gets up and he starts going yeah. And then he starts really feeling it because the whole crowd starts cheering him on. Yeah.
He starts getting into it a little bit. Yeah.
He's wearing suspenders and everything. So,
oh man,
there's footage of him fighting Ron Stander, and when I say this is an absolute ass kicking, Merritt just thumps him badly. And there's nothing skillful about it. He's literally just walking up, and it's like some early 90s George Foreman style, just walking and bow, boom, with this uppercut. Bow, it's over and over. And Stander's a tough guy. He's not easy to put down. But he's just taking him and taking him and taking him. His head is snapping back. And any sensible referee would have stopped it after the fourth time his head went flying. But Stander finally collapses. And then he gets up, and then Merritt hits him a couple more times. The referee finally stops it, but it's sadistic almost to see, and it gives you a slight hint of what kind of type of dude Merritt was, and you can easily see right there that he would definitely take a receipt to Shavers for being mistreated as he felt was being mistreated.
Yeah, and I guess there are actually a handful of other those kinds of stories in boxing too, of fighters who were supposedly mistreated before or whatever, and or mistreated in camp. Who's the one with Jack Johnson? Jack Johnson supposedly was friends with, oh shit, I can't remember who it was off the top of my head, but I think that was there was some rumor as far as, shit, was it Jack Blackburn? And that was part of their falling out about something.
Yeah, I know. I think Blackburn was more just bitter at Johnson for the fact of just how he just acted back then, and kind of
anyway, I can't remember who specifically it was, but there was somebody that there was kind of a turnabout's fair play situation, but whatever. I ain't gonna waste too much time on that. But splitting the difference between Shavers and Ali then There's also a story from the earlier 70s that Ernie Shavers was sent out of Ali's camp, kicked out of Ali's camp because he managed to drop Ali. And Ali supposedly said, yeah, he dropped me with a lucky shot. It's a left hook and right hand. And I went down for a count of two. He got lucky and knocked me down. That was just a training session. It don't mean nothing. All right. Does kind of sound like Ali. I'm not going to lie. But he said Shavers must make a public apology before he's allowed back. I could believe that. That sounds like Ali for sure. That sounds like Ali for sure. But I mean, again, just circling back to the, maybe you shouldn't spar as much. And Ali is definitely one of those fighters that kind of, I believe, we seem to get that revelation, or it seemed to become a little bit more evident that perhaps the sparring and the hits to the head and shit weren't a good idea.
Well, here's another one too. More recent, still regarding the heavyweights. Vladimir Klitschko and Lennox Lewis both have had some rumors of getting roughed up in sparring. Notably, Lennox getting knocked out by Layman Brewster. That's what I read over here. I read that too beforehand too. That this was before, I think it was his fight with Rahman, which what could make total sense, because obviously he was not taking that fight seriously. I think he was
that was Ocean's 11.
Ocean's 11, exactly. Yep, Ocean's 11 and all that stuff going on. So yeah, conceivably, and for Brewster, as limited as he was after a few rounds, man, that dude was explosive as hell. Like, he was a beast for, and tough guy, and he had a monster left hook, and I could conceivably easily see that.
I think, as I kind of understand it, I think he was I know that he had a lot of connections and knew a lot of other pro fighters and stuff like that as an amateur, so he had a lot of fighter friends. And I think that, from what I understand, he was a bit of an underachiever, both as an amateur and a pro. But that,
talking about Brewster?
Yeah, Brewster.
Okay.
But that, again, as I understand it, in the gym, as in sparring and stuff like that, he was a beast. He was a scary dude. He was obviously very talented, but that it was just it didn't really pan out or whatever. But that I mean, I could totally see that. He had punching power. He had speed. He did have skill. You could see it in some of his pro fights too. But another guy who I think that I'm not sure if he has one of his eyes anymore. I know he has really severe eye issues now, but
yeah, he should not have had that Klitschko rematch.
Yeah. So I could believe it, I guess, is my point. I could totally believe it. And
remember when he blitzed Galata?
Yes, I totally remember that shit. I was not expecting, dude. Galata was on a nice kind of like career resurgence, had some bad luck with some decisions.
That's probably why Don put it in Chicago too, no? Because he was kind of banking that Galata would finally cash in.
Well, it's silenced. There was a big contingent of Polish fans there, and they
were just... I think Adamek was on the undercard too.
Yeah, that was bad. So yes, I mean, clearly there were moments at which he kind of like lived up to his potential, but just couldn't sustain anything, unfortunately. But like, I could believe it. One of my buddies at the time worked for Warner Brothers and said that he had seen Lennox Lewis on the lot like more than once, which kind of suggested that he was not taking the training that seriously and was spending more time being a celebrity and filming and shit. And also adding in the extra element of Hasim Rahman had already lost a couple times before that, had already struggled in a couple of his wins. Like, I mean, he had to go through some shit to beat Corey Sanders. A lot of people forget that shit was actually a pretty good fight.
Man. Oh my God.
Yeah, nobody ever talks about that shit.
Great fight. It
was a real good fight. So, I mean, you could see it like, all right, well, you're only fighting Hasim Rahman, so who gives a shit? You don't have to train very hard. I could see that. But Layman Brewster, dude, don't sleep.
No, absolutely not, man. For a brief period he won that belt, what, in like 04, 05 around then? Something
like that, yeah.
Yeah. For a brief period, he made for a lot of fun fights. because he had that fight. He had that fight where he was basically screwed, where he had to go fight Chris Nicky on, what was it, Max Schmeling's birthday, I think it was. And or close enough to it, remember?
And wasn't that the fight where like the ref is like,
everybody was against him, and he finally scored a knockout to win it.
yeah, like there was like the ref was like helping Krasniqi up at some
Yeah,
point,
yeah. It was everything, man. But he was like, he pulled a Siki, but actually like pulled it out.
yeah. Yeah, dude, that shit was that type of shit is super frustrating to watch. But yeah,
even his fight that he lost the belt in against what was it, Liakovic, that was a really, really good fight too. So
I for a minute there, I was certain that Sergey Liakovic was like going to be a bad dude, but he was just for like 15 minutes though. That was about it. But no, it was, and actually the Briggs fight was pretty good too. But anyway, yeah, this is what happens is we start just ambling down these paths of random discussions. But yeah, I could definitely see Layman Brewster dropping Lennox Lewis, and I could definitely see I'd actually heard there've been rumors, all sorts of rumors about specifically Vladimir Klitschko getting dropped in sparring. I could see that too, because he's always excuse me, seemed a little bit chinny.
For sure. There's been rumors that his brother was dropped as too, Vitaly, even though Vitaly's been known to have a monster granite chin. It kind of goes both ways, but like, I've heard the rumor and I've read this one that was mentioned on this one, that Friday Ahunanya, who was, I guess you can consider him a fringe contender in the early 2000s. I mean, he was featured on a few fights. He was featured on an HBO pay-per-view, I remember, in a very forgettable fight. And, he was known. So I guess he was on the fringe of, fringe contender or whatever. But yeah, they said he rocked Klitschko's world and in a sparring session. And there's been a few other guys around that level too that got the better of him.
Friday Ahunanya was like among that right around the same time. There were a handful of Nigerian dudes who were at heavyweight and kind of busting through there and about to make some noise and stuff like that. Who was another one, like David Izon.
It came a little bit before him. Yep.
There were right around that same time, there were a number of Nigerian heavyweights that were just like came real close but didn't quite get there. I mean, in Friday Ahunanya, he showed some spurts of talent too.
No, he did. He just wasn't very exciting about it. He came on the scene, I think, when he beat Nate Jones, and then I remember the most I remember about it is that Cedric matched him up when Cedric had Tua on a little bit of a roll, trying to cash in with a Klitschko fight. He matched him up with Ahunanya, and that went the distance. But win was a win. He was hyped about it regardless. He was like, yeah, we got another win. But yeah, he was a tough guy. He was very hard to knock out too. So to bring to another point, which I'll tell you one was actually like, it's pretty adds to the aura of another heavyweight. Ike Ibeabuchi himself was caught up in some shit back in the day that I read about in KO magazine. I talked about it with Cedric and some other people, but there was a session he had with Ezra Sellers. You remember Ezra Sellers?
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Ezra Sellers was cruiserweight, I guess heavyweight at times, but a French contender, another one from like the late 90s, early 2000s, but another dude who was a really, really good puncher, weak chin, but made for fun fights. Regardless, he had a sparring session one time with Ibeabuchi and got the better of it, actually. He it was a tough fight. It was a tough sparring session, but like Sellers caught him with some shots, and at one point he caught him with a hook right here or whatever it was, but he nicked Ibeabuchi, caught him on the corner of his eye, nicked him a little bit. So the session was stopped. Afterwards, while they were getting ready, after the session was over, Ibeabuchi got out of the ring and he saw Sellers getting dressed and putting his rings on and his jewelry and stuff like that, right? Ibeabuchi sees him putting his rings on and snaps and starts accusing them and goes, he had his rings on, he had rings on, he hit me with rings, and everyone's just like, what? And before everything knew, all hell broke loose. Ibeabuchi runs over, attacks Sellers, and attacks his manager and everyone else. Kicks Sellers in the leg and like damages his knee and like messes him up and like goes absolutely batshit crazy because he said that Sellers was wearing rings when they sparred and that's why he was cut.
Oh, the president.
Yeah.
Mr. President, bro. The guy was involved in so much wild stuff, dude. I mean, yeah, I would definitely, needless to say, I guess I got to give a short plug, but Luke Williams wrote a book called President of Pandemonium for Hamilcar Publications that you should check out if you're at all intrigued about Ike Ibeabuchi. Um, in the early 2000s, there were like recurring threads or topics that would come up, right? All the time. One of which was, when is Prince Nassim Hamed coming back? Another one was, when is Mike Tyson going to be champion again? Another one was like, when are we going to see a focus Zab Judah? Some shit like that. But that was
a big topic that actually made like magazine covers.
Yeah, dude. But this was among these topics. Was yeah, that's fucking hilarious.
But yeah, man, Ike was I remember reading that when I was like young and seeing that in a magazine and like that whole story, and I was like, what the hell? And first off, that makes absolutely no sense. Wow, if he wearing inside of it, even if he was wearing rings inside of his glove, like none of that would, the size of sparring gloves, none of that would make any sense. None of it would even work.
I know. I know. That's some of the craziest shit. When anybody is accusing somebody else of having shit inside of the gloves, I'm like, have you ever worn a glove? The fuck are you talking about? There's no room for anything.
The way he was describing it, you'd always think, like, I'll go back to that episode of The Simpsons where, when Homer was boxing.
Yeah.
And then Mo puts on the glove with the barbed wire around it, and he was like, that's basically the way Ibeabuchi was explaining it.
He's got a horse. It's like a cartoon. He's got a horseshoe in his glove.
Yeah, some shit like that. But nah, Sellers caught him with a decent punch. He got split in his eye, and then he got mad about it. But the sad part was, he said that he kicked poor Sellers in the knee, and Sellers was legitimately messed up from it, and he was like out of action for a number of months because of that injury.
That's fucked up, dude. That is fucked up. Well, needless to say, Ike Ibeabuchi left a lot of damage in his wake. I mean, it's.
If his fight, how do you think his fight with Andy Ruiz would have came off?
Oh, dude. I mean,
I was hyped for that.
Talking about fighting up or down to the level of opposition, that's like Andy Ruiz now. I don't know what he's doing as far as his like getting into shape, not being in shape, dedicating to training, not being dedicated to training. But like, it's sad to say, but it's like, if there was one quote unquote top heavyweight that Ike Ibeabuchi would potentially have like a shot against, it might be Andy Ruiz, because he's right there. Like
they were discussing that fight. Remember when he first got out of jail? They were like, yo,
in Ibeabuchi's
2014, 2015. I don't know when that was. Like
he's had all sorts of issues with his extradition and like his felony issues. Like there's been an immigration status and stuff like that. So it's like it's been an up and down roller coaster with that guy. But yeah, dude, if there was one, I guess Andy Ruiz at that point wasn't the top fighter, but if there was like a recognizable fighter, and I don't know, but Ibeabuchi's, a wild guy, needless to say. But some of the other guys that were on this list, just to kind of go through a few that I didn't know about anyway, and again, don't know if they're true, but found interesting. Supposedly Marvin Hagler dropped by Bobby Patterson in 1986 while training for Mugabe. Hagler claimed to be off balance, but said it was a good shot. He got straight back up saying "good boy" to Patterson, and it just states Patterson's record, which I guess was not very good. Said he was retired at the time, I guess. Below that, it says that Ray Robinson was dropped by Coco Kid in sparring in 1949 while training to fight Steve Belois. Rocky Marciano floored for a 3-4 count from a left hook to the jaw while training to fight Don Cockle in 55. British journalist Peter Wilson said it was properly nailed, that it was a knockdown, no question about it. and I guess Al Weil agreed. And so if Al Weil's if Al Weil's corroborating it, then I guess it's probably pretty legitimate. Floyd Patterson dropped by light heavyweight Harold Carter while preparing to fight Terry Daniels. That's a full decade after he was champion, but nonetheless, Patterson wasn't exactly difficult to drop either. Joe Louis dropped in sparring by sparring partner Eddie Malcolm by right hand in 37, training for Bob Pastor. Another Floyd Patterson dropped twice in 3 rounds by Mel Turnbow, training to fight Ali. Again, not difficult to drop
What about
Floyd
Jerry
Patterson.
Quarry knocking out Ken Norton?
Yeah, that was
I found that one kind of that raised my eyebrows a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know about all the timing of that. Like, I think there's a little bit too many, but I still found that pretty
think about
interesting.
it. If they say that Norton was stopped by Quarry, like someone did mention, there was a lot of bad blood in their fight, and Norton seemed to take a little bit of pleasure in beating the hell out of Quarry. But conceivably, it could have happened because Quarry was, if this is the early '70s, Norton was still, tweaking his style, and he wasn't like a guy that had a long amateur career and was going through a lot. Like he was still working on it.
That's right.
Quarry was obviously on the rise, so it's conceivable that early on when they were sparring, that Quarry could have taken advantage of him and beat him up.
That's true. No, that's true. And on top of that, it's not like Ken Norton himself was super difficult to hit. He didn't move a lot.
Especially back then, he was stopped and he struggled. And before he caught his stride with Ali, it wasn't like everyone was thinking he was going to be the next great thing.
Totally. Yeah, totally. So I could see shit like that.
Yeah.
And again, going again back to the issue of that, like a lot of these fighters, like some of these fighters come up again and again and again. Lewis, Ali. I mean, how often were these fighters sparring? Like 5 days a week, so of course they're gonna get fucking dropped. It happens.
The thing about Jerry Cooney getting beat up and sparring before his fight with Holmes kind of makes sense now too, when you think about how that fight took, how the Holmes fight ended up, and considering that Cooney was out of the ring for so long and only had 2 1-round fights before that. Like he wasn't prepared for that. He just kind of got shoved into it, so many ups and downs, postponements, all this other stuff like that, that easily a guy like Leroy Caldwell, who we've discussed on the show and has been featured on YouTube, and for I think Tris Dixon interviewed him for his wonderful series. And I want to say that, he was just a journeyman heavyweight back in the day, but one of those experienced guys that you weren't going to take him out and fought a who's who of everybody. And they said that he was easily slapping Cooney around in sparring. So, and Joe Bugner as well. So, I mean,
Yeah. And I wouldn't be that shocked for a lot of these. It's just, they're not outside the realm of possibility. And some of them are like, given the time frame and stuff like that. Oh yeah, I could totally see that. And I mean,
Charlie Magri knocking out Bruno, I have no idea what that was about.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that might have just been some good old fashioned message board tomfoolery.
Yeah. Magri, I'm not even sure if he reaches like Bruno's thigh, right?
Yeah, I don't know about
tough
all
guy.
That, well, another one that's like, it's not necessarily knocking down or hurting per se, but another fighter who kind of made their name, at least earlier on in their career, as a sparring partner for somebody much more famous, was Jose Luis Castillo with Julio Cesar Chavez.
Right.
As he was fairly young, and at the time was, I think, a junior lightweight or a featherweight, and was sparring with Julio Cesar Chavez and doing, a noticeably a good job, and wound up kind of making a name for himself that way.
Absolutely, man. When he first came on the scene and when he finally beat Stevie Johnston, he's built himself to where I would say he's deserving to be on the Hall of Fame ballot. So is he on? No, he's not on the ballot yet, right?
I don't know. I'd have to look.
But I don't think so. No, because someone definitely would be mentioning his name, or he would be brought up at least in consideration. So I don't think so. Castamayo's on the ballot. Corrales is on the ballot. Why isn't he on the ballot? That's a discussion for another day.
Yeah, well, damn. Now I feel kind of bad that I don't know immediately, but regardless, yeah, he had a very, very good lightweight career, and kind of, I guess there's no going wrong with sparring with Julio Cesar Chavez, because he's got already a couple.
Man, if that's your apprenticeship, you're learning from the absolute best.
Yeah, a
Well,
couple fighters already.
you can even like use like Bernard Hopkins as an example. When Bernard Hopkins said that John David Jackson taught him how to fight southpaws with all the times they sparred together and they trained together, to the point where when they eventually fought,
Yeah, and then repaid
ended,
him.
yeah, and Hopkins ended up stopping him and putting him into retirement.
Yeah, repaid the favor.
Yeah,
Well, the true passing of the torch. Man, Hopkins really did go through that division, but that was another guy who's was legendary among the Philly gym scene too. Supposedly, it was Hopkins.
yeah, man. There's a story they knocked out one of my favorites, Charles Brewer, in sparring.
That's I had heard that for years, and Charles Brewer had that kind of puncher's paradox issue where they can punch like a madman, but not the greatest chin.
Mm-hmm.
And when he got tired out too, like it was over. So I could
Absolutely.
see that for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to see some of those sparring sessions from back then. I know how vicious they were, but they were just, something that would be interesting. Like another one that I've actually heard about before, but then it was mentioned on this forum, was like when Michael Moore first came on the scene with Emmanuel Stewart. They were looking for guys, and Moore started tearing through everyone in the gym. And then he sparred Matthew Saad Muhammad and broke his his ribs.
Wait, it broke whose ribs?
Michael Moore broke Matthew Saad Muhammad's ribs in sparring.
Yeah, I guess that would have been, well,
That would have been like the late 80s.
yeah, that would have been
Probably, yeah,
sod
yeah.
on the decline for sure, obvious, or well declined.
Well declined. He had no business fighting at that point.
Yeah. Well, and I think that while he didn't have the greatest division or the greatest wins to go through, more at light heavyweight, but he still was, at least as far as the eye test goes, pretty entertaining fighter and a good fighter at light heavyweight anyway.
Oh man, he was awesome, dude. If you watched him, he does match up well with like anyone from that era, or if you want to like put him up with certain guys in history. I'm not going to put him at the top realm, but I think he'd make for fun fights with all of them. Like Moore was an absolute monster at that weight. He just obviously couldn't, stay there that long. But I think the fact that he had that, how tough it was for him to make weight, and just his demeanor at that point made him such a bitter, angry guy that he took it out on his opponents.
Yeah, no shit. He had a hell of a time making light heavyweight. He just wasn't a huge like a guy. So going to heavyweight was like against the size
But
of fighters
when
that
he
were
moved
coming
to
up.
heavyweight, he just kind of let himself go too. He wasn't like a Holyfield,
Yeah.
but that like kept himself in shape, or a dedicator, or even like Michael Spinks, for example. But like he just kind of like, you notice right away after his first few fights, and then after that he just kind of, well, that's it, fuck it.
Yeah, no shit, dude. Well, I mean, I at least with Michael Moore, I believe that he could be a pretty formidable gym fighter, but unfortunately, it's got to come against one of my favorites, and Matthew Saad Muhammad. Poor guy.
Yeah, man, that's not a sparring session I'd be looking to find footage of. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, you can find me anything with like Gerald McClellan, any of the other guys from the Kronk gyms, some other stuff from the Philly gyms, all that, the West Coast. Sure, find me all that. Find me a washed Matthew Saad Muhammad getting beat up by young guys. I'm good.
Yeah, no, I'm good with all that.
So,
But no, dude, it's all of these kind of gym tales and legends and myths and all of those things, dude. I think they're definitely among the more fun things to talk about in the kind of mythical realm. I guess some of them factual and realistic realm of boxing fandom and shit.
I mean, that's just what makes everything so fascinating about the sport, that you can have a full discussion about what goes on in the gyms, and the behind the scenes, behind the fights, and all that type of stuff. It's awesome.
Totally, dude. Well, hey, man, I appreciate you hanging out and doing another nerd out discussion with me, bro.
Yeah,
Always a
man,
good
this
time.
was a blast. This was a really good one. This was a
For
lot of
sure.
fun.
Always a good time. Well, hey, everybody, thanks so much for watching. If you watched, and listening in, if you listened in, I very much appreciate it. While you're waiting for the next show, I don't know what it'll be. We'll figure something out, but go on to YouTube, for instance, if you'd like to subscribe there, or subscribe on one of the various podcast platforms that we're on. You can give us reviews on any of them, or comments, replies, all of those sorts of things. But we're also on social media. So if you're on Twitter, for instance, follow my buddy Aris Pina at Punch Zone Aris. Follow me, Patrick Connor, and Patrick M. Connor. Facebook, Instagram, all of those sorts of things. And take it easy because we'll see you next time. Aris, talk to you soon, bro.
Have a good one. Thanks, everyone.
Peace, everybody.